Hello, my name is Barbara Robertson, and I'm a journalist. I've been writing about computer graphics, animation, and visual effects for a number of magazines for many years, including Computer Graphics World. So it is my great pleasure to introduce Paul Debevec, Associate Director, Graphics Research, University of Southern California's Institute for Creative Technology, and a research professor at USC. I've had the opportunity to interview Paul several times over the years and to learn from him. He has the unique ability to explain what he does in words I can understand, and he has the patience to do so, so you're in for a treat. And I understand he'll have a few minutes after his talk for questions, so be sure to ask those questions. Paul is best known for his work with high dynamic range imaging, image-based modeling and rendering, and in finding, capturing, and synthesizing the reflectance field over the human face. What that means is that his work has had a huge impact on filmmaking, on the ability of visual effects artists to light CG elements and characters using the lighting from a live-action environment. And that helps make the integration of CG elements and characters into a live-action film seamless and believable. Paul received his undergraduate degree in mathematics and engineering from the University of Michigan and a PhD in computer science from the University of California. His thesis research was in photogrammetry, on creating the 3D shape of an object from a collection of still photographs, a technique soon used to great effect for the bullet time sequence in The Matrix and many films since. Paul's more recent research has resulted in a number of novel inventions for recording ambient and incident lighting, including the light stage, which is often used by visual effects studios who want to create photorealistic digital characters in films, like Benjamin Button. Now he's working on bringing photorealism to real-time characters. In 2009, Paul, along with Tim Hawkins, John Manos, and Mark Sagar, received a Scientific and Engineering Award from the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences for the design and engineering of the light stage, capture devices, and image-based facial rendering system developed for character relighting in motion pictures. So please welcome Paul Debevec.
Good morning, buongiorno. Barbara, thank you for what, that was like the best introduction I think anybody could ever possibly hope for. Thanks for that, and a lot to live up to. I brought a couple things to talk about, and a lot of them do involve lighting, in particular lighting for digital actors. Barbara mentioned some of the kind of early work I was involved in capturing light from the real world. And one of the ways that you can do that is to put to basically take an omnidirectional photograph that you have in the scene. And a quick way to do that is to put a mirror ball in the scene. Mirror balls date back to the early 1980s in computer graphics as quick ways to get panoramas. And the thing that I helped figure out how to do with them is that if you shoot a whole series of exposures to capture the full range of illumination, then you can actually use that as an image-based light source to light objects with arbitrary reflectance properties. And this is an example from a young digital artist who is 17 years old at the time that he did this. He was a fan of the video game Half-Life 2. He'd gotten the models out of the game so he could load them in 3D Studio Max. And he thought it would be fun to try to make it look like those video game characters came to visit him at his parents' house. So he put a light probe device into the scene. Here it shows a lot of the ambient illumination, the light from the ceiling, the bounce light from the walls. There's a lot of light coming from this door here, and since the dynamic range has cut it off, there's really no way to tell how bright the light was from out there or what color it actually was. So to do that, he used the technique of high dynamic range photography to bracket the exposure to lower and lower and shorter exposure times until he could actually see into the area outside, and you can tell it's actually a combination of some blue sky and some neutral light bouncing off the patio. And using high dynamic range photography techniques, you can take this series of images and turn it into one image that has pixel values that go from 1 to 1,000,000 if they need to. A great format to save these images is the OpenEXR format created by Industrial Light and Magic. And once you have that, you can practice image-based lighting, which is the process of wrapping that image of the incidental light around your scene. It's even better if you project it onto the walls of the environment that the object's going to go into. And then you start a global illumination algorithm to light the scene from that image. And these are some of the light probe images that you can find on the website here. When Nick Burtke made his renderings, these are how they came out. Here's some characters from Half-Life 2 visiting him at his parents' house. They're coming in the door here, making themselves comfortable on the bed, checking out the chair, and eventually staying late and watching some television. And the thing that's really neat about this is that he had a crazy image in his head, which probably when he thought about it was totally realistic. But if he just made a drawing of it or a rough computer model, he wouldn't have been able to communicate really how fun his vision was. And by taking advantage of physically based rendering, using the real light, making it so that the shading on the character is believable, as if it was really there. And even the shadows into the scene are the light and the shadows that you would get if that character was really there. He can produce these photorealistic images that communicate his vision that much more realistically. So this is great for a video game character, but I became interested shortly after this in how could we apply this kind of illumination to the human face. And I thought about trying to do something kind of like a literal interpretation. Maybe we could somehow wrap a huge television set around people and light people literally with the illumination that we'd captured panoramically. Well, I was still a postdoctoral researcher at Berkeley, and building an enormous television set around people seemed a little bit beyond my means. So it seemed like a better idea would be to record how the face reflects light one lighting direction at a time, and then simulate the effect of an entire environment later. And so to do that, I worked with some students at Berkeley to build the first light stage. And it was built out of wood, plastic pipes. It had a single 250-watt spotlight. It was pulled on ropes. And in the course of 60 seconds, if you had somebody sit here, you could spin it around and get the person's face illuminated from every direction that light could come from. This is a long exposure photograph of the path that the light takes. And if you put a video camera aimed right at the face, then you get a data set of what that person's face looks like lit from every direction light can come from. So you can see that these faces are lit from the center, these are from the top, from below, from the right, from the left, even from behind. It gets all those important rim lighting directions that are important for movie lighting. And then if you have one of these high dynamic range light probe images, you can unwrap it into the same coordinate space over the sphere, longitude and latitude, and figure out for each one of these images what was the color and intensity of light in the environment you want to light the face with that environment. And to do the lighting, it's actually pretty simple. You have the response of the face to sort of unit intensity white light from every direction. If you multiply it by these colors, then now the images of the face have become the color and intensity of the light from that environment in the corresponding direction. So these here are bright and yellow because there's bright yellow light coming from that direction in the environment. And we've lit that face from that environment one light source position at a time. And if you want to simulate all the light at the same time, you can simply add these images together. Light adds, images add. If you add the images together, then it will produce a rendering of what this person's face looks like lit by that lighting. And it's the right answer. You can see the rim light from the altar of the cathedral. You can see the stained glass windows reflecting in his nose and lighting up his hair. This light over here is coming from the end of the nave because the door's open. There's some natural illumination coming out. And it even has all of the indirect light bouncing from the floor and the walls of the cathedral. So that seemed like a useful technique. It wasn't very computationally intensive, and you can quickly change to any lighting environment that you want. The problem is that it was just a 2D process. It's not a three-dimensional face, and it's nothing that you could animate, so you can't really use it to create a digital actor. We had a chance when I got to my institute, the Institute for Creative Technologies at USC, to build Light Stage 2, a second light stage, and even more importantly, to work with some people at Sony Pictures Imageworks to try to apply this technique to an animated digital character in a movie. And Light Stage 2 was built out of a semicircular arm of strobe lights. This is another long exposure photograph, so you can't see exactly what it looks like when it's stopped. This took 8 seconds to recover, to record all the lighting directions. In the stage is Alfred Molina, who played Doc Ock in Spider-Man 2. And Sony brought over 4 35mm motion picture cameras, recording him from different directions of illumination. And as you can see, this is the data off of the central camera. And it's a data set of how this guy transforms incident light into radiant illumination. He was really good at staying still for this. And based on this and the other views, and also a cyberware laser scan to get the geometry of his face, Sony was able to build a pretty darn good digital human character, especially considering this was done 10 years ago, that could respond to light no matter where you put it. And this ended up getting used in a number of shots in the film. So these are some of the Spider-Man 2 digital Doc Ock shots. It even got used for this scene toward the end where it's pretty much a full face across the screen for when he falls down into the depths for his final scene there. So that was a great application of some of the technology. Spider-Man 2 was also a really good movie, so it's always nice when the films that ask you to work with them end up turning into nice projects. The problem with this, though, is that the character didn't perform close to camera very much. And it seemed like if we're going to start recording actors, we shouldn't just record stills of them. We need to find some way to animate it a little bit more accurately. They had basic motion capture techniques, so they could get it to look pretty good for far away, but the only close-up shot didn't really have him doing anything. So trying to record somebody in motion while you have control over the lighting became the idea for the next light stage, and that was Light Stage 3. So Light Stage 3 is the first time that we actually built the first sphere of lights around somebody. And the lights that we chose were RGB color LEDs. And this was finally the realization of that idea of surrounding somebody with a big television set that could literally display the light of a different environment on them. So it wasn't a very high-resolution television set. It just had 156 light positions. But once light reflects off of human skin, to some extent, it blurs it out enough that it can still look realistic. So this is an actor being lit by the light of one of our light probes. These are 3 of the light probes. And these are composites of lighting them without illumination and then compositing them into the scene. And here's a couple of results from back then. So the software makes it possible to rotate the lighting. It transforms it into the best approximation you can with the 156 lights. And we actually had the actor on a turntable. And it was programmed so that as we rotate them on the turntable, the lighting on them will rotate in sync with the turntable motion. And that gives the effect of the camera moving around the actor. We also implemented an infrared matting system, so we didn't have to use green screen and pollute the light on the actor for that. If we divide that infrared image by a clean plate, there's some black cloth in the back that's lit by infrared light. And it is black in the visible, reflective in infrared, so it kind of works out. Then we got these, this is very early work, but she's lit by the light of our light probe, and she's composited into it. In Grace Cathedral, we had the same actress, and I realized that effectively we're displaying an image of environment around her, so I could direct her to look at the stained glass windows. She could actually see where they were in the scene and look from one set of stained glass windows to the other. So this actually becomes useful if you're directing an actor in this situation, that they get to see at least a low resolution of the environment around them. Here's a place from Italy, the Galleria degli Uffizi in Firenze. There's another actress. We had to synchronize the 2 cameras with a stick. And so we're spinning around her. And the last result is putting somebody into a virtual set. So we had this model of the Parthenon. We used the Arnold rendering system to render out the light. And this is the background plate. In addition, we rendered out a virtual panorama of moving down the colonnade. And the idea was that the actress would look like she's walking down there. We really should have used a treadmill because walking in place doesn't look all that realistic, unfortunately. But you can see as she walks forward, the light on her changes as the scene goes by. And she walks into the sunlight, she walks into the shadow, and even as she passes by these colored banners, you can see she picks up different colors of indirect light on her face. So she becomes a little reddish when she's next to the red banner, a little bluish when she's next to the blue banner, because the entire sphere of illumination is being simulated on her. So when I originally presented this work at SIGGRAPH 2002, I gave an idea of what a fourth light stage might look like. And the idea there was that, let's actually try to shoot a movie in one of these things. So this is one of the slides from my SIGGRAPH 2002 talk where the idea was, let's build a big one. And what we could do is we could put the camera on a robot arm and move it in and out and around the actors so we'd have that control. And we even put the sun on its own robotically instrumented camera arm with the idea that LEDs probably are never going to be able to be bright enough to really play the role of the sun accurately. So we might need to just go with a physical, traditional light source and have that orbit around on its own if we really want to get those sharp shadows and that smooth shadow motion on somebody, if we're going to do the lighting reproduction approach. So the technique seemed maybe a little far-fetched at the time, but it wasn't too long before we got approached by the movie industry to possibly apply this on a project. And it came in the form of a visit from Digital Domain with a film director named David Fincher, who was thinking about how to create a photoreal digital actor for the movie The Curious Case of Benjamin Button. That movie wouldn't come out until 2008, and so he was already thinking about how am I going to do this in 2004. And David Fincher's original thought was that he would do the head in computer graphics, but he would use the eyes of Brad Pitt literally from photography of Brad Pitt. The question then is, how can we film Brad Pitt's eyes close up so they can composite onto a digital character? Because he really thought the life of a character comes from the eyes. But then the lighting on the character has to match what you're going to composite into the scene. Well, Digital Domain was aware of this work that I'd proposed and thought, well, maybe we can use a light stage to illuminate Brad Pitt literally with the environmental lighting of his digital character, and then the eyes will match in. The problem is that we didn't have that many light sources, and the reflections in eyes weren't looking so good. You could see all the little dots in there. So I thought about this, and my proposal to them was what we should do is use this new invention, which are LED panels. And I came up with an arrangement of let's build basically walls of LED panels around our actor, and let's film them under this reproduced illumination. And the hope was that the LED panels, this is a mock-up my digital artist made at the time, that the resolution would be sufficient so the eye reflections would actually look okay. So we made a phone call up to Barco up in the San Fernando Valley and asked if they would build one of these things for us just to test. And they wanted to help, but they weren't into completely building out the surrounding thing. What they did do is they set up one wall of what we could do. And I went up there with my laptop, a graduate student, and some friends, and we tried to take our lighting reproduction to live action compositing and make it work in the context of these LED panels. So one of the things that I did was I got the Grace Cathedral light probe. I rendered out just one section of it over there. I put an actress looking at it, photographing there, and then we looked closely into her eyes to see if the reflections would actually work. And by goodness, they actually did. This did not end up being a technique that was used on The Curious Case of Benjamin Button. What happened is that Digital Domain went and tried to do a full photoreal CG face, and they actually got good enough at it that they could completely make it happen. I think that some of probably John Knoll's work done in the Pirates of the Caribbean and the Davy Jones face kind of led the way to we can do believable eyes in computer graphics at this point. But the technique did come up for use in a motion picture a little bit later. In fact, the next movie that David Fincher made after The Curious Case of Benjamin Button was a film called The Social Network. And in this movie, which is not known for having a lot of visual effects, there is a character, actually two characters, who are the Winklevoss twins. They're the people who are the folks who end up in a fight with Mark Zuckerberg over who came up with Facebook. And they were cast originally as two actors, Armie Hammer, who you can see here on a light stage, and Josh Pence. And at some point they realized, or David Fincher decided, you know what, I really want them to look the same. I'm not going to take identical twins in the real world and try to play it off as if they were fraternal twins in my movie. So that meant that one of the actors, it was Josh Pence, got the call that he would be wearing dots on his face for most of his scenes and getting replaced in every single scene. This is one of the scenes that ended up using a lighting reproduction approach to doing the face replacement. Now, most of the scenes are just done traditionally, where you act it twice, you switch the actors, and then you do it again. In this case, what they did is they wanted to not create a full CG version of Armie Hammer to replace Josh Pence's face with, but they had the very reasonable thought of, you know, if we could just film him in the right lighting in a studio, we could put his face on there after the fact. And so a relatively tricky shot like this, where they're rowing a boat down a river and you can't just easily tell them to switch and we're going to shoot it again, could be done. So again, Digital Domain was tasked with trying to do this. They approached us, hey, let's actually try that Light Stage 3 thing. And they brought Armie Hammer over to our light stage, and we shot this test, playing back a light probe image that was actually shot on the set. This is the audio from the movie here.
Is there any way to make this a fair fight? Jump out and swim. You'd have to jump out and drown. Well, you could row forward and I could row backward. We're genetically identical. Science says we'd stay in one place. Just row the damn boat.
Now, the final shot was actually done by Lola Visual Effects when they got the job, using similar techniques.
Is there any way to make this a fair fight? Jump out and swim. You'd have to jump out and drown. Well, you could row forward and I could row backward. We're genetically identical. Science says we'd stay in one place. Just row the damn boat.
So pretty cool. And that's an example of a movie where, you know, you just can't have it look like a visual effects shot in the middle of the film, because it would completely take you out of the story. It's supposed to look something like it's the furthest away from visual effects as you can get. So that got us through Light Stage 4. The next thought that I had that would be kind of cool is, can we record an actor's performance but change the lighting in post-production? So, you know, it can be a little inconvenient to have to know how to light your actor at the time that you're actually filming them. So maybe what we could do is do a very fast version of the light stage, where we'd capture all the different directions that lighting can come from over and over and over. And then every single frame can be relit the way we did back in Light Stage 1. That was the idea behind Light Stage 5. And what we did is we got these bright white LEDs. They'd just come out in 2004, and they were just bright enough to actually pull this off with high-speed photography. We saved up all of our research money for the year, and we blew it all on LEDs and a high-speed camera from Vision Research that could shoot standard definition up to 4,000 frames per second. And these LEDs were just bright enough to do that if you put a fast lens on. And we would record people in lots of lighting directions near simultaneously. We actually had a chance for a Discovery Channel TV show very recently to do this again in high definition, because we have a better high-speed camera now. And so this is what we actually ended up shooting. So this is one of those technology host type people. And you can see he's lit from all these directions that light can come from. All of this was recorded in the span of a 60th of a second. And then we recorded that 30 times per second. So we're running about 2,000 frames per second. And if I play this, you can see that he's performing. And it's kind of cool to see exactly the same performance lit in all of these different ways. And then if you take these as different lighting passes, then, I think actually you can hear him speaking here.
Hey, it's Lucas from Future Tech. Now, normally I am talking to you about the future of technology, but today I'm actually standing inside of it.
And then what you can do is you can add the images together, relight them. If you need, you can do some optical flow to make them seem like they were shot at the same time, and get a result like this.
Hey, it's Lucas from Future Tech. Now, normally I am talking to you about the future of technology, but today I'm actually standing inside of it.
And so there he is in Grace Cathedral after the fact. We never lit him with Grace Cathedral. And if we want to change to a different light probe, then here we go. We didn't get the best matte, so don't complain about our matte lines, but here he is in the Galleria degli Uffizi, a much different kind of lighting environment. So that might have some use at some point as well. And in fact, I'll show something that we did on a test for a movie that made use of some kind of variant of this technology soon. A neat thing happened once we had bright white LEDs all around our actors in the light stage, which is that I realized that we could actually light people with more intelligent lighting patterns than just one light at a time. And one of the things that had bugged me is that we hadn't really ever gotten very good geometry of faces out of our light stage data. In Spider-Man 2, they had to go and do a cyberware scan of the actors in order to have something to project on. It also kind of bothered me that at the time, if we wanted high-resolution images, one light at a time, we had to work with people who could afford movie cameras in order to shoot it, and we wouldn't really usually get the data afterwards. So I tried to think, is there a way we could digitize faces using fewer lighting patterns, we could get geometry, and we could still get everything that we need in order to show the face under different lighting conditions after the fact. And that was the idea behind a new facial scanning process that we developed, and we used on a project called the Digital Emily Project, which was a collaboration with Image Metrics. So in this case here, we're not going to record her performing in the light stage, but we're going to try to get a bunch of different facial expressions digitized at high resolution. So this is Emily O'Brien, who's an actress who was brought in for the project. And the new face scanning process made use of a stereo pair of just regular Canon 5D cameras in the front. And we used these specialized lighting conditions. I couldn't use very many because I wanted to go fast enough so the actor wouldn't move before we were done. And also, we had to fit within burst mode of what the cameras can record, which is about 17 images. So as you'll see, the lighting that we use is actually very blurry lighting conditions. It's actually full-on light and then soft gradients of light from top to bottom, right to left, and front to back. It's actually based on the first 4 spherical harmonics, which is useful for lighting in other contexts as well. At the end of the sequence, we would put some video projector stripes on the face, and those would make it easy to triangulate pixels from one of the cameras to the other and get a basic 3D model of the face. But we found that wasn't good enough for getting all of the detail of the skin pores and the fine creases and what you need in order to be able to simulate realistic-looking skin. So in order to understand the skin reflectance and understand the skin geometry better, we used a technique called polarization difference imaging to record and isolate just the specular shine of the face. You'll see that this first row of images looks very diffuse. The second row has a specular shine to it. And if we zoom in, well, the first thing we'll see is that we put funny dots on her face. That was in case for our different expressions we could more easily create a blend shape model. We don't have to do that anymore, fortunately. But if we zoom in here, you'll see that this is an incredibly flat lit image of Emily. Light is coming from everywhere, and there's no specular shine to her skin. Even though she's surrounded in all these light sources, you don't even see any of the points of light in her eyes. That's because what we did is we put linear polarizing filters, just like the stuff you have in polarized sunglasses, on all of the lights at just the right angle so that that specular reflection, which will maintain the polarization of the light, ends up polarized vertically as it arrives at our cameras in the front. And we put a polarizer with the opposite polarization direction, horizontal, in front of the camera, so it blocks the specular light. The light that does get through is the light that got underneath the skin and went through subsurface scattering and picked up the skin color and lost its polarization as the result of bouncing around a bunch of times. And that light does get through. Unpolarized light can get through a polarizer. This ends up being a very useful image if you want a texture map for your digital character, because it has very little shading or lighting and it has no specular pollution. Now the cool thing is we can very rapidly flip that polarizer from horizontal to vertical, and all of the specular shine comes back. A nice even specular shine from the entire sphere of illumination comes back. And we can just flip it in 1/10 of a second, take the other image really quickly. Now you can see the light sources in our eyes. And if we subtract this image from this image, because the subsurface scattering comes in about the same both times, we get an image of just the specular shine of her skin from the entire sphere of light at the same time. We don't see much skin color here because this light didn't get into her skin. It's the reflection right off of the front. And because it's the reflection right off of the front, it actually shows us an enormous amount of detail of the person's skin. You see the fine bumps, you see the fine creases. If we use our different spherical harmonic lighting patterns from different principal directions in the sphere, then we can see how the light plays off of the skin and actually very quickly get a very accurate surface orientation measurement for every pixel of her face. And from that, we can get a very high resolution model by using the details analyzed from the specular reflection and the base scan from the stereo correspondence. So we got a bunch of scans of Emily, and those got used to help create this digital character back in 2008 in a collaboration with Image Metrics. It started by filming some reference video of Emily in the Image Metrics studio, and then she came over and spent about 90 minutes in our light stage, during which time we got diffuse reflection, specular reflection, and we solved for geometry. Without the specular, it's pretty smooth, but analyzing the specular reflections, we can get all of this detail, and that's going to help her digital character look much more realistic. The real key is that we have many facial expressions. You saw them, 30 of them that were recorded. It's kind of an alphabet of the things that a person can do with their face. And when we built the digital character of Emily, it's built based on all of the things that she really looks like when she goes from one facial expression to another. And it was very eye-opening for me to look at all of these expressions side by side and see just how different the human face can look as you go from one expression to the next. You can see fun things like muscles pulling underneath the skin and giving it tugs, flesh piling up in the middle of the nose, all sorts of crinkles and wrinkles that just magically appear and disappear as you emote. So, and of course, in addition to the geometry, we get a great texture map that's automatically aligned. And if we do some hybrid normal mapping or subsurface scattering shading, it starts to look like skin. Now, this is an important part of the process because what Image Metrics did is they took all of those different facial scans and they made a face rig out of it, a digital puppet of Emily's face that if you pull on these puppet strings, it will then blend in the shape in different facial areas of what her face actually did when she moved those facial muscles. So all of the shapes that this is going to make are going to be based very closely on shapes that her face was actually observed doing. This is just a low-resolution preview. It doesn't have a skin shader. It doesn't even have the detail yet or any of the right lighting. But you can take the detail and blend it in with the same blend weights as your geometry is blending in, and then get that to show up at render time. The next thing that Image Metrics did is they have a really awesome process for having a user in the loop to semi-automatically animate a face based on video without using any motion capture markers. And so these are example frames analyzed by an artist to pose the face to match. The computer learns from these examples how to drive the face based on how it looks in the video. And then the final animation will come as a result of a lot of the timing and motion of the video and some artistic supervision to make sure that all of the key poses actually have the right meaning that you'll see. So this is the low-res preview. You can see it matches the facial motion. The final result is done by moving that on top of her face in the video.
Matrix is a markerless, performance-driven animation company. We specialize in high-quality facial animation for video games and films. Image Metrics is a markerless, performance-driven animation company. We specialize in high-quality facial animation for video games and films.
So only the face was digitally rendered, the whole rest of it, and this of course helps a lot, her hair, her body, that's all real. But everything in the face is replaced. You can see here, this is the diffuse channel. If you look at the specular on its own, it looks a little funny. But that's a lot of the crinkles and wrinkles of a human face. The underlying polygon mesh, not too bad. If you take it all away, that's the original video. And we didn't match the original video 100%. But what it did do, and this was a relatively good thing to be able to do back in 2008, is that when we showed it to people, they thought it was a real human face. We showed it to Emily, and she wondered what we'd spent all of our time doing because she just thought it was video of her on the couch. And that was a good sign that we were starting to narrow in on how to create photoreal digital human characters. So another thing that was exciting is during the same time, we had a chance to apply this high-resolution facial scanning technology on a movie, which turned out to be a really cool one, which was Avatar. And Avatar has a lot of digital characters. The ones that we know about, or most well-known, are these Na'vi creatures. And of course, there's no way to actually put imaginary person from another planet in your light stage. But as it turns out, the filmmakers were very astute to realize that if they wanted the performances of actors like Zoe Saldana and Sam Worthington and Sigourney Weaver to play believably on the faces of their avatars, that it would be a good idea to make the facial anatomy as close as possible to the actor within the constraints of the story. So the design actually is that everything from the cheekbones down is the face of the actor that plays that avatar, and even the rest of the face borrows from the other facial characteristics as much as possible. And that helps things like Zoe Saldana's very nice performance here read well once it's mapped onto Neytiri. So they were actually filming all the motion capture work for Avatar quite close to our institute, so it was not a big deal to bring over Zoe Saldana and the other actors to the light stage. We got some nice data of them, of their maps and their geometry, and we sent all of this down to Weta Digital, which has their own amazing artistic and technical teams, and this is one of the elements that they made use of as they created these amazing digital characters. We did scan a bunch of cast members. Some of them became avatars. This guy here, the bad guy, Stephen Lang, who plays Colonel Quaritch, actually doesn't have an avatar, but they did want a digital model of his face so that he could be a digital stunt double in a lot of scenes where he's having fights with the Na'vi in his amp suit. And when you have this kind of shot where essentially almost everything in the shot is computer generated, the forest, the amp suit, the lighting, the cockpit, the controls in the cockpit, it would be a kind of pain to film him on a green screen and stick him in there and make him look like he was really part of all of this other stuff going on. So having him a digital character that can hold up at least at this distance is helpful. We got a digital model of Sam Worthington as well. His geometry came out nicely. If someday he needs to play a young version of himself in the future, then that data exists. And that got used in part to help create the Jake Sully character, but also some human stunt doubles of him, particularly when he interacts closely with Neytiri. Sometimes he is completely computer generated. And one of the neatest scenes where that happens is here toward the end of the film, where they're trying to transform him, and Neytiri very slowly leans down to kiss him. And they certainly could have shot him on a green screen and then added the computer-generated character above, but in this case, there's a lot of lighting interaction between the faces. Neytiri casts a shadow, bounces some blue light onto him, he bounces some pink light onto her. There's these bioluminescent materials that are coming up from the bottom, and it would actually be kind of difficult to do all of that with a photographic element and a digital element coming together. And they just had a lot more control by having a digital version of Sam Worthington. So again, it was nice to be able to have a chance to have some technology apply on there. It's another recent character that made some use of some light stage data is some really very, very cutting-edge work by Industrial Light and Magic for the Avengers, where they had the task of turning this actor, Mark Ruffalo, into a Hulk. And they did light stage scans of Mark Ruffalo to understand his human face. And another thing that they did is they actually, this is some footage graciously given to me by amazing visual effects supervisor Jeff White. In the light stage, they actually shot one light at a time data of Mark Ruffalo, so the digital stunt double, they would have excellent lighting reference to know what his face looks like. And they could have people tweak the skin shaders and the reflectance models until those two matched up for every single lighting direction. So these shots here, when he transforms, are actually 100% digital all the way through, from human to Hulk. And again, if you can pull it off and have a photoreal digital human, it's easier to have the thing be completely digital all the way through than have to do a handoff from photographic element to a digital character. So the last thing that I'd like to show from a movie has to do with some work that we did for the movie Gravity, which is a really awesome cinematic experience that came out recently. I was first approached to do some stuff for Gravity by a fellow named Chris Watts, who's a visual effects supervisor. He's one of the VFX supervisors for the movie 300. And he had been brought on by Warner Brothers early on to figure out what kind of technology can we use to do some of these very interesting space shots that are going to happen in the film. And some of the work that we did as a test ended up getting published as a research paper back in Eurographics 2011. So this is all work that we actually did in early 2010. And the idea I had for how they could create the faces inside these astronaut helmets was optimized to try to think of how can we give the most flexibility to people in post-production. How can we control the viewpoint and the illumination as a post-production process? Because that seemed to be the thing that would make the easiest result for the film, if we could pull it off. And so we set up a system where there were actually 5 high-speed cameras aimed into a light stage going through very rapidly changing time-multiplexed illumination conditions. And they hadn't cast Sandra Bullock yet, so they had a test actress named Margarita Levieva, and they brought her in. This is actually from our shoot. Some of the light stage guys, Tim Weber from Frame Stores somewhere here. There's Alfonso Cuarón, who's going to be directing. That's him peering into our light stage and working with the actors in there. And we designed a special lighting basis that would make it possible to record the reflectance and the geometry of her face in real time at 24 frames per second. So you're seeing the lighting conditions that are happening. This is actually slowed down massively from the hundreds of frames per second we were shooting on these 5 cameras. And if you look at the patterns built out here, this, by the way, was an amazing performance. One of the coolest things was getting to watch Alfonso Cuarón work with an actress directly and whip her into this frenzy that she's running out of oxygen and tumbling out of control, and he got a pretty remarkable performance out of her. The top images are basically showing that we're going through our gradient illumination patterns. We weren't able to polarize them at this speed, but some techniques for separating the diffuse and specular reflections made it possible to approximately relight based on a diffuse specular reflectance model with some decent surface normals. And then what we also did for validation, and also just to show out the lighting reproduction approach, which you could also use, we set up a couple of lighting conditions designed to mimic the light from planet Earth from different directions on her. So if you look at these images a little bit more closely, you can see that we set up as if like the Earth was here, and the Earth was here, and the Earth was here. So I know that in the program, the title of my talk was Global Illumination, and I didn't talk about that too much, but hopefully these images showing light from the Earth hitting somebody will count as global illumination. Okay, bad graphics pun. The next thing that we did is we analyzed the gradient illumination conditions from all these different camera positions, and in some work led by Graham Fife in my laboratory, we solved for 3D geometry of her face for every one of these frames as she's giving the performance. And in addition, we solved for a diffuse map and a specular map and some other reflectance maps. And that allowed us to simulate a new light source from a different direction after the fact. There's a couple of little bugs and pops here. It's just a test. But it seemed like this would be a pretty realistic way to go, because she was never filmed in this lighting condition, and we simulated it after the fact. This is simulating her with a light probe image. It's one of the light probe images on our website. And we can see that we're showing her from the exact same performance from 3 different viewpoints. So this data set was actually set over to Tim Weber's team at Framestore. They could validate it against the actual lighting reproduction of the sun, of the planet from different directions. And they got some decent results with it. But ultimately, they realized that with the direction that the script was going, that this was going to be a film that would require a lot of this kind of faces put into helmets. And shooting it on these high-speed cameras that can only record for about a minute, and then you have to download to hard drives in a long way, is going to be too impractical for the production. So instead, they reverted to an earlier technique, which is the lighting reproduction approach, the idea of wrapping a big television set around somebody's head and filming scenes. And this time they were also able to do some of the other things, like put the actor on a rotation gantry, rotate the light simultaneously with them to give the appearance of camera motion around in these directions. And they also used a robotic camera arm in order to move the camera around with this lighting reproduction system that they built. And it was definitely a new way of filming this much of a movie for this kind of approach, but the results were obviously pretty amazing.
Listen to my voice. You need to focus. I'm losing visual of you. In a few seconds, I won't be able to track you. You need to detach. I can't see you anymore. Do it now.
Let's try. I'm spinning. I can't.
Record your position.
GPS is down. It's down. I can't.
Give me a visual.
I told you nothing. I see nothing.
You have a visual of Explorer.
No.
You have a visual of ISS.
No.
You need to focus. Anything. The sun and the earth. Give me
I can't
coordinates.
breathe.
Give me
I can't breathe.
coordinates. You're burning oxygen. You have to sip, not gulp.
And you can see, perfectly good for eye reflections as well, which is cool. So we're getting toward the end, and I just have maybe 1 or 2 more things to show here very quickly. We got to work on another cool collaboration on trying to create a digital character, and this time it was with a video game company called Activision. And we got interested in trying to be able to create not just a digital actor that looks pretty much like a real person, but maybe one that we can also render in real time. Wouldn't that be cool? And so working with this amazing team at Activision, led by Javier van der Palen, we got an unsuspecting colleague, or at least someone who should have known better, Ari Shapiro, to pose for some light stage scans and become digital Ira. And I'll take you through a video that shows you how this came together. That's digital Ira. I wouldn't say he's 100% photoreal, but it's the first time we tried this, and he does render in real time, which is kind of cool. So there he is in the light stage. We got a bunch of different facial expressions, and we wrote a new tool that lets us correspond at 4K all of the UV coordinates from one scan to the next. So it's very easy now to just put on sliders and blend shape from one expression to the other, and it all lines up to the subpixel. The other thing that we did is we put our new cameras that we have in the light stage, which have a movie mode, and we recorded just under kind of flat lighting conditions some performance clips of Ari Shapiro right after we scanned his face. And this is going to become performance data that will be used to drive his character. The algorithm that Graham Fife led the creation of automatically figures out for our blend shape facial model which area of the face should be driven to which blend shape as he performs. And this colored interpretation is showing for every part of his face which expression the computer thinks that Ari Shapiro is making as he performs. So right now his whole face is yellow because he's smiling, and the computer detected that he's making a smile expression with his face everywhere. and it'll figure out that the shapes better match other expressions when he gets rid of his smile. And this is the final result. There's a lot of other stuff going into this here. In particular, we gave these performance clips, we gave the high-resolution scans over to Activision. They found a way to render this in real time. This actually it won't quite run on my MacBook Air, but a 2-year-old gaming laptop can actually render this face at 180 frames per second. And that's important for Activision because they want this to work on the next generation of game consoles for their video games. They need to justify why they're doing this, and it seems like it's going to be viable for that. One of the most notable things beyond the screen space subsurface scattering algorithms that some of their team members pioneered is a great eye model that renders in real time. It has reflections, refractions, it has caustics inside the nice reflection of the iris. It even simulates the interreflected light between the edge of the eyelid and the white of the eye, which are both relatively bright surfaces, and they communicate with each other in terms of their lighting. So that really helped make this character at least start to come out of the Uncanny Valley. And something that was surprising to us when Activision sent over these frames is that they went in so close on the face, because we knew that they actually were going to have to take our 4K texture maps, and they actually ended up sizing them down to 2K for the real-time character, and I thought that was going to blur out the skin pore detail. But they actually had read a Eurographics paper that we published where we were capturing microgeometry of skin of these little 1 centimeter skin patches and then using some texture synthesis algorithms based on David Salison's image analogies algorithm to up-res an entire face to high resolution. And so they looked at our skin sample patches, which are at 100th of a millimeter resolution, and they came up with some procedural shaders, some sums of little sine waves that will roughly approximate what skin microgeometry looks like. And they added those in. So all of this detail you're seeing here is actually procedural synthesized detail on top of slightly down-resed versions of our scans. And certainly not everything holds up at this resolution, but the fact that the skin looks as good as it does can largely be thanked by the fact that they kept detail at this scale, because skin really does have detail at this scale. That's a nice eye caustic in there too. And that's the game mesh. So hopefully the next generation of video games will make use of this. And for the version that was shown at SIGGRAPH, they actually got a little bit of hair on the fellow as well. So that was good news. So I think that is basically what I managed to bring for today. I'd like to thank the many, many collaborators who contributed to all of this work. Thanks to Maria Elena for organizing a great view conference and making it possible for me to be here. Thanks to all the studios that we got to work with to actually make the things look really cool. And finally, these are some websites here that have links to a lot of the papers if you're interested in more information. I think there's some time for questions. Thank you very much.
Hey, is the high frame rate system where the lights would move around disturbing to the actors, or is it a high enough frequency that they don't notice it's the light source changing?
Great. So great question. Whatever we do, we try to make it. We try to think about, okay, what's the experience for the actor going to be in this thing? And flashing lights can be really, really annoying. If you're photosensitive epileptic, it can be a medically dangerous situation. The most annoying rates that lights can flash at are between 9 and 20 hertz. 24 hertz, 24 frames per second is actually pretty close to that. So the times where we record people, like what we did for the gravity test, we actually went through our series of 11 lighting conditions 72 times per second, triple the frame rate. And what would have been nice to do is just have the camera grab the first 11 and then kind of go to sleep for 22 frames and then grab the next 11, and then we'd have a bunch of them for every 24 frames per second. Since we were recording to the compact flash memory instead of the RAM of the camera, we didn't have enough bandwidth to do that. We had to go to the compact flash. And so what we did is we actually, over the course of a 24th of a second, we recorded every third frame. And since 11 and 3 are relatively prime, in the course of a 24th of a second, you actually get a unique view of every one of those 11 lighting conditions. Since it's going at 72 hertz, nobody can see the lights are flashing. I mean, if you like really saccade your eyes around, you can kind of tell. But you're basically in just a big, even, bright ball of light at that point. And we had to run optical flow to take all of those conditions to look like they're shot at the same time. But our lighting patterns are designed in a way so that some of them, basically we do a gradient this way and then we do a gradient this way. And those two add up to a full-on, which we also film. So we can basically do this joint optical flow process to flow all the frames to the full-on condition. And we were definitely concerned that with the magnitude of that performance of her shaking her head that Alfonso got her to do, that we were going to be a little hosed on optical flow working, but it pulled through. It did okay.
When do you think digital actors will completely replace real actors in movies?
Maybe at the same time robots replace all of us, which is, I guess James Cameron has a prediction for that, right? Well, so I think the important thing to note right now is that we've never seen, we've seen convincing digital actors in movies, but we've never seen a digitally created performance in a film. The only reason that we like the performance that Gollum or Davy Jones or Benjamin Button or Caesar delivered on screen is that there was a real flesh and blood actor working with a trained director on a good script, providing a good performance, which at least was a jumping off point, even if animators did eventually go and replace parts of the performance afterwards. So there is something very magical that happens when an actor interprets a role and says the lines and gives the emotions, and that's 20 years of AI before we even start to do that, and that's not my department. So we'll have to wait. It'll be interesting.
Now that you've been so good at pushing through the Uncanny Valley threshold, are you going to be the next level of realism? Is it going to be like simulating the whole biological system so that it goes as close to the real person as well, or is it going to be like a indiscerning visual effect that nobody just cares about what goes next?
Well, I think that's a fascinating direction for research. I think it's a great thing to work on. Maybe we'll work on it at some point. A collaborator of ours named Mark Sagar, who was part of the Spider-Man 2 project, part of King Kong, part of the facial animation things that happened at Weta Digital for a while, is now a professor at the University of Auckland. And he is very interested in exactly this problem of simulating brains. And he's done this kind of crazy thing, which is he has a baby daughter named Francesca. He made a 3D model of her face and a computational simulation of her brain. Now, it's obviously not, a perfect human brain simulation. That's a long way off. But it actually is to the point where he's simulating the visual cortex, he's simulating serotonin, he's simulating dopamine, he's simulating, uptake of various chemicals and visual attention models. And there's a digital character, you see this baby's face that you can walk up to, and there's a webcam watching you, and you can interact, and she looks at you, and if you get happy, she gets happy, and if you stop paying attention to her, she might get sad or might start to cry. And I think that there is possibly a use for doing these kinds of things. In the area of digital actors, 20 years from now, you might actually be able to, tweak somebody's emotional content up, 10% and then see how they play the scene or something like that. A lot of research has to be done. I doubt we'll ever perfectly simulate a human brain because we probably have to raise our digital character with digital parents in a digital environment to do that. But there's a lot of fascinating things. I think we might even learn something about ourselves in that direction.
I have another very quick question. When you said you worked for Avatar and the Sam Worthington digital model you recreated, Was that some kind of a tip for the next avatars?
I have no idea what's going to happen in the next Avatar movies for that, but the data is available if they need to do a digital character again. Certainly.
You said for a younger Sam Worthington.
Well, that would be so. If we imagine that he remains a big Hollywood star, until the year 2035, and then he's an older man and needs to play a younger version of himself, that would be. We have the data for that.
I'm still suspicious.
Okay, great. That ends our time. Thank you very much.